So welcome. If this is your first session, welcome to the Fair Share Summit. We are thrilled to be building on a conversation that many folks in Canada have been working on for decades. We've had strong threads of internationalism in Canadian social movements for decades, and really happy to be building on that work and reinvigorating a conversation around Canada's fair share to tackle this massive climate crisis. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We are recording this session. We're going to be posting it on the website, and we're going to use it to get your wonderful contributions from the chat and from the workshop, which is the second half of the session, to build upon that for the work ahead. One note to please use the Q&A box that should be at the bottom of your screen. It might be under the little tab that says more. But either way, please do use the Q&A to ask questions of our panelists as we go on. There's no question too stupid or too basic. We're all figuring our way out, and these issues are not very often talked about in Canada. So we're all here to get on the same page. Please feel free to use the chat as well. Really, we want to hear your thoughts. We want to hear you grappling with the ideas. There are one more thing is we have, given that we're in a virtual space, and so the sort of agreements around respect and accountability have to be negotiated together in a virtual space. We do have a set of community guidelines, as well as a statement of values that just popped in the chat. Another place to put your thoughts and feelings and inputs is we have a thing called a Padlet. I don't know if folks have ever used this before, but it's a wonderful little site. I just put the link in the chat. And the Padlet is a place, it's a multimedia place where you can just sort of put in your outstanding thoughts, questions, making connections, musings, your own contributions, ideas about policy proposals or other groups who are doing this work, or movements or people around the world. It's a catch-all space, and we're going to have that available through the entirety of the conference. Please use it, get messy, get in there. About the summit a little bit. So the goals of the summit are to help, as I mentioned, to help build a critical internationalism within the Canadian climate movement. Recognizing that our local and our regional and our national struggles are stronger and more robust when they have an international lens to them. Also recognizing that as we work on phasing out fossil fuels within Canada, reducing our emissions and tackling the climate crisis in Canada, those gains are counteracted by the actions of our government in the international community, where we're undermining climate justice in other parts of the world. And so when we think about the broader fight of climate change, we have to recognize that climate knows no borders. The impacts hit all of us at the end of the day. And if we ignore our role in the global context of the crisis, then we undermine our work here at home as well. So ideally, by the end of this conference, we will identify some areas of unity to build into more focused campaigns to be able to build power around and push our federal government to act. Last thing, this conference is focusing on a few major pillars of achieving a global climate transformation. One is climate finance. We had a session earlier today that was absolutely fantastic. This session is on trade and tax justice. Our trade and tax regimes are two massive barriers to climate justice as well as opportunities. And tomorrow we will have a session on financial institutions and debt. This is missing some other key pillars like subsidies and fossil fuel phase out, but there are other folks in our movement who are doing amazing work on those areas. Without further ado, I want to pass it over to our incredible moderator for today's session, Bianca Mugyenyi. Bianca is the co-founder and former director of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute and the former co-executive director and co-founder of The Leap. She's co-author of the book Stop Signs, and she's written for the Toronto Star, CBC, Ottawa Citizen, Telesur, and Hill Times. She's done so much incredible international work and carries an incredibly nuanced lens on these issues. She currently sits on the board of directors at the Council of Canadians and is based in Montreal. So I'm going to pass it over to Bianca. Thanks so much, Bianca.
Oh, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Anjali. Very kind of you. I just want to give a huge welcome to people at home, as well as our panelists today. It's so wonderful to be here and to be a part of this conversation. So as Anjali has mentioned, this is the Tax and Trade Justice panel of Canada's Fair Share, a summit on global climate equity. And this is such a critical, important gathering. And I want to offer just a huge thank you to the Climate Emergency Unit and the Padma Center for Climate Justice for hosting, and all the people behind the scenes who've worked so hard to put this summit together. I just really appreciate everyone who's taken the time to be here for this discussion. So today I'm speaking to you from the island of Montreal, or Tiohtià:ke, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people and the keepers of the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is a place that has long been a point of meeting and exchange among many First Nations. I just want to start by saying, the organizers of this summit have stressed the just how imperative it is for those who are working towards climate, ecological, economic justice in Canada to examine our government's role in the climate crisis internationally. And what I have found, what we find when we dig into Canada's role abroad, in particular its foreign policy, is that we see that it's designed in large part to advance the interests of Canadian corporations. And as a result, Canadian foreign policy is deeply anti-ecological. So some examples. One egregious form this takes are the investment accords that Ottawa promotes around the world to give Canadian corporations the ability to sue local governments in international tribunals for lost profits, which we'll be hearing a little bit more about. Recently, a delegation of Indigenous Ecuadorians impacted by Canadian mining interests came to Ottawa to press the government against a trade accord, which includes an investment agreement that would further enhance the power of Canadian mining companies in that country. And today, Hadrian Mertins-Kirkwood will be discussing the subject of trade and its implications for climate justice in more detail. So Canada, is one of the highest per capita greenhouse gas emitters, requires us to drastically reduce our contribution to the crisis. And to reduce Canada's outside footprint requires massive mobilization of social resources towards a just transition and away from the pockets of fossil fuel wealth holders. And DT Cochrane is going to discuss the role of tax fairness in transitioning away from Canada's huge per capita GHG emissions. So I'm partially here in my former role with the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute and now board member, which challenges Canada's harmful policies abroad, as well as Canada-China Focus, which aims to provide a space for discussion around Canada-China relations. So I'd be remiss not to mention another element. So we've been seeing the Canadian government defying its own green technology plans as part of joining the US's bid to contain China. So most recently, they've slapped tariffs on Chinese renewable energy technologies as part of their target China policy. And this is a concrete example of prioritizing geopolitical competition over the climate crisis, but it generalizes. And as Noam Chomsky put it, we must work together or perish together. And it's exceedingly difficult to imagine the achievement of collective global cooperation, which is required to mitigate climate breakdown, while we have things like the US and China moving towards war, let alone all of the horrifying conflicts, the genocide that we're seeing in Palestine, and so on and so forth. These things are not compatible. And more generally, we can't be serious about confronting the global climate emergency without the spirit of internationalism. Like, we have to be grounded in that spirit. And we know that many of those who have contributed the least towards this emergency suffer the most in the climate crisis. So what we need is a just foreign policy, which includes the trade and the tax justice that we're going to be talking about in order to generate the kind of goodwill that we need to work together. And the spirit of internationalism, which is running through this summit, really compels us to join forces beyond our borders in collective, global, common defense of people and planet. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers. This afternoon, we'll be hearing from Hadrian Mertins-Kirkwood and then DT Cochrane. Hadrian is a senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, where he focuses on the social and economic dimensions of Canada's shift towards a net zero economy. DT is currently senior economist at the Canadian Labour Congress. Previously, he was an economist and policy researcher at Canadians for Tax Fairness. DT has a master's in economics and a PhD in social and political thought. He has researched and written about a variety of economic issues, including the role of corporate pricing power in the recent bout of high inflation. Welcome to our first speaker, Hadrian.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm just going to share part of my screen here. All right, so hopefully you can all see that. Yeah, thanks very much for being here, everyone, and thanks to the organizers for the invitation, to Bianca, DT for being part of this. I'm really excited to talk about this. I got my start professionally working on trade policy, and then more recently looking at climate and economic issues, and now it's kind of come full circle. Well, trade and climate are interacting. But it's not actually that fun once we get into it. Sorry, it's going to be a bit of a bummer of a presentation. What I'm going to talk about is what I'm calling tools of the trade, how Canadian trade and investment agreements undermine climate justice. And for the first, for this kind of introductory presentation, I'm really going to just try and set the stage a little bit, and then we can get into more of the details through questions. So, don't hesitate to ask for clarification or examples of anything I'm talking about. So these are three big things I want to figure out today. What do we mean when we talk about trade? Because there's trade and then there's trade, and that's the second one is the problem. What is Canada's relationship with this international trade and investment regime? Is this kind of thing we're being kind of dragged along by the US? Spoiler, no, we are fully in the driver's seat here. And then finally, as we're all, this is what this event's all about, how do these trade and investment agreements undermine climate justice? So I'm going to get into that towards the end. So let's start with just figuring out what we mean when we talk about trade, because as I said, there's trade and then there's trade. Trade is not the problem. And as we've just heard, and it's been a theme today, international cooperation is necessary, it's beneficial. The mutual exchange of goods and services for everyone's mutual benefit is not a problem. We should be acting in solidarity with other countries, working with workers and communities in other countries. That's not the problem. But when governments talk about trade, that's not what they're talking about. What they're talking about are international trade and investment agreements, or IIAs. I'm going to try not to use too many acronyms, but IIAs for international trade and investment agreements. These are essentially constitution-style policy frameworks that are designed to limit what governments can do to control their own economies. So it's something that our government will negotiate with another government that includes all sorts of policy, copyright policy, environmental policy, tax policy, all sorts of stuff that then supersedes our own domestic regulations. And there's a ton of these. There's more than 2,500 IIAs globally. That number's a few years old, but in the ballpark. So thousands of these agreements have been signed between countries all over the world, and mainly at the behest of multinational corporations, especially in rich countries that are trying to maximize profits abroad. That's a very key motivator here. It's not the only motivator, but it's a key motivator. And you can see that when we look at the evidence for these international investment agreements, because on the face of it, they're supposed to increase trade, right? Increase growth to everyone's benefit. And surprisingly, there's very little evidence that that's true, which is, I think, surprising even for critics of this system who would probably be willing to concede, like, yeah, maybe this isn't a just system, maybe it's a colonial system, but surely at least the economy is growing because of these trade agreements. But that's not what we find. We find profits increase for foreign investors and multinational corporations, but not general prosperity, not workers in general. And that's obviously a big problem. And we're going to talk about how it's specifically a problem for climate justice in a minute. And we should also note, because this is something Bianca mentioned, that a lot of these investment agreements, and certainly it's almost everyone that Canada signs, and it's a priority for our government, is to include this system that allows individual investors to sue other countries for damages, technically unlimited damages, for anything that they claim could affect their profitability. So it's a really egregious system. It's deeply entrenched in the global economy, but we don't actually talk about it that much domestically. So speaking of domestically, what is Canada's relationship with this regime? As I said, thousands of agreements, kind of constitution-style documents signed between all these different countries. Well, it turns out we are very much on the offensive. This is not an area where we are getting dragged along by other bigger economies. No, Canada is very much at the forefront of pushing for trade investment liberalization. These numbers are a couple years old, but in the same ballpark, that we've started or negotiated 85 different international investment agreements covering 75 different countries. And that's just what we call bilateral, which is Canada and one other country, or multilateral, or rather plurilateral, which is Canada and a few other countries. It's not counting the World Trade Organization and these multilateral deals, which is like every country, which we are also part of. But all that to say that we are aggressively pursuing these deals with basically the entire planet. And I could have used lots of different quotes, but I like this one from the government, which is that Canada's prosperity hinges on, very strong language, hinges on, we require it, on modern trade rules which open markets for our goods, services, and investment. And I think what I love about this quote is it belies the purpose here, right? This is not saying that we need trade with other countries for mutual benefit, for the mutual exchange of goods and services. No, it's actually a very violent metaphor. It's about getting into and prizing opening markets, bypassing domestic regulation and trade barriers in other countries so that we can inject our goods, services, and investment, put Canadian capital into these other countries. It's very explicitly the purpose of this trade regime. And we see that because it's not that we're negotiating with all sorts of countries, obviously dozens and dozens of countries. But you can see that where Canada is prioritizing, especially new agreements, is often in developing countries that host Canadian mining and energy companies. So you can see that in this map. Don't worry about the colors. They're just different types of agreements at different stages of completion. But anything that's not gray is a place that Canada is pursuing or has pursued one of these types of agreements. And some of them aren't surprising, right? We have North America, we have NAFTA, we've had that one for decades. You see it, we've deals with Europe, Australia, like countries that maybe you'd expect. But then there's this very curious band of sub-Saharan African countries that we have agreements with. And it's like, why in particular does Canada need a bilateral investment treaty with the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Zambia or Mozambique, right? What about all these agreements in Latin America or Central Asia? Like, why are we negotiating agreements with these countries? Is it because we are trying to import goods and services from the DRC? No, I mean, it's obviously because we have a huge mining interest in these countries, and our federal government is trying to basically steamroll a path through local controls in those countries to allow us to extract resources at a maximum profit. And you can see that in how these agreements are used. So I'm going to show you another chart. Again, don't worry about all the details. What we just care about here is the purple bar. So the purple bar on the left is the extractive industry's share of Canada's whole economy. It's about 8%. So it's sizable, but it's not that significant. 8% of our economy. The middle bar is the share of Canada's direct investment abroad. And the extractive sector makes up about 16%. Again, we're looking at the purple bar at the top. But if we look at which industries are using our trade agreements, at least by the metric of ISDS, which I'll talk about in a second, but at least by this one metric, 70% of the companies that are taking advantage of our treaty protections are extractive companies. So it's very clear that this system exists to benefit the extractive sector in Canada. And that leads me to the last little introductory piece I want to talk about here, which is how do these agreements undermine climate justice specifically? Well, let's start by talking about how they undermine climate action, because they undermine climate action everywhere, not just in developing countries, but in Canada as well. Because these agreements, as I said, they're kind of constitution-style documents, and they place limits on all sorts of things that we would expect that our governments can do. Public ownership, public procurement, domestic preferences, and all sorts of other tools that would actually be very useful for tackling climate change. I mean, one very good and clear example is Ontario brought in place, this is more than a decade ago, a subsidy regime for wind power and other renewables. And it included local preferences. So if you were a local producer or local manufacturer, you could benefit more from these programs, and that encouraged a bunch of investment in wind power in Ontario. And then Japan challenged that through the World Trade Organization, said, well, that's unfair. You can't privilege your domestic suppliers over international suppliers. Canada lost that case and then scrapped that whole subsidy program. And now we're more than a decade behind on wind power in Ontario because of that. And that's just when other countries sue Canada, or Canada could sue other countries. But then we have this system layered on top of investor state dispute settlement, or ISDS, that allows foreign investors to sue governments directly for policies that affect their profitability, which is kind of wild when you think about it. It's this kind of quasi-judicial system that elevates foreign investors, not domestic investors, only foreign investors, only multinational corporations, to kind of like a quasi-statehood where they can take another country to court at an international trade tribunal, which is not a real court. It's not judges, it's just trade lawyers who make these decisions. There's no appeals process, there's no like legal precedent. It's not a real court, it just looks like a court. But these arbitrators can award technically unlimited damages that are enforceable through international law. And so the fact that a system exists really is a huge threat to efforts to curtail fossil fuel production. We've actually seen that in Canada. Canada's phasing out coal power, which is excellent. It's the most successful, definitively the most successful climate policy we've ever done in Canada. It's phased out coal power. But that triggered ISDS cases from American coal companies who are saying, well, we were going to make a lot of money in the coal sector, so you have to pay us millions of dollars in compensation. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. But the real issue, and this is where the justice piece comes in, and certainly the justice in a global perspective, is that rich countries can afford to fight ISDS cases, which are very expensive in terms of legal fees, but we can also afford to lose ISDS cases. If Canada loses to Westmoreland Coal and has to pay out $100 million in compensation, Canada can do that, and it's not that big a deal for us fiscally. That's not true for a lot of developing countries. When a country like Venezuela is charged by these arbitrators to pay out more than $1 billion in compensation to a Canadian mining company, like they don't have that kind of money. And so what happens when when these governments in poorer countries are forced to pay out, or the risk of paying out on these huge awards, is they just roll back policies. They roll back environmental policy. They roll back social policy because they just can't afford the risk of losing an ISDS case. This map just shows where Canadian companies have used this system to sue foreign governments. And you can see, like, we're not suing the US, we're suing Latin American governments, we're suing sub-Saharan African governments, we're suing not Western European governments, but Eastern European governments, the less rich part of Europe. So, Romania tried to prevent Canadian mining company from chopping the top off a mountain to dig up, I believe it was gold, and then leach a whole bunch of cyanide into the water. And then the Canadian mining company involved sues the government of Romania over the course of a decade or whatever. These just like egregious cases here. And again, you can see that it's not just that like extractives are part of this system. It's definitively the reason the system exists. And what this chart is just showing is what is the underlying government policy that triggered an ISDS case over time. And the takeaway here is that it's environmental policy and energy policy, as well as related resource management policies, that are driving Canadian investors to sue foreign governments. Those countries like Colombia taking measures to protect fresh water or vulnerable ecosystems, and then that triggers ISDS cases from Canadian mining companies. So I could go into a lot more detail about all this stuff, but just again, to summarize, what do we mean when we talk about trade? Well, we're not actually talking about the mutually beneficial exchange of goods and services. We're talking about a trade regime that is essentially a pro-corporate legal framework to the benefit of multinational corporations in particular. What's our relationship? We are absolutely a global leader. Canada is not being dragged into this against our will. We are pushing for trade investment liberalization, especially in developing countries. And then what does that mean for climate justice? Well, lots of things. We can unpack it more in discussion, but extractive companies can use investment agreements to sue poor countries that try to advance social and economic justice. And the mere threat of these kinds of cases is enough to dissuade governments from enacting policy. We call this regulatory chill, where a government just decides not to enact policy because it's afraid it's going to be sued, even if that policy would have been in the public interest. So I know I kind of rushed through all that, but if you're interested, all the figures that you saw come from a paper we published a few years ago called On the Offensive, which you can read for free on the CCPA website there. And I'll also note, while I have your attention, that I do have a newsletter called Shiftstorm. It's a monthly newsletter all about climate and the economy. And you can sign up for that at policyalternatives.ca/shiftstorm, where we write about this sort of stuff as well. So I'm going to stop it there and turn back to Bianca. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Hadrian. What a terrific presentation. Thanks so much for the accessibility as well of that overview. It's so good to be able to better understand the trade regime, Canada's role internationally, and the ways that these trade and investment agreements are an attack on climate justice. This is definitely the type of information that we need. We need a lot of knowledge mobilization around this. Also of note, clarifying these egregious trade policies are so often driven by Canada, that we're leaders, which means we should be paying very close attention and have an onus, an even greater onus to act if we're serious about international solidarity, serious about climate action. And yeah, the ISDS, I'm sure we'll talk more about this in the discussion, but just so alarming to really get the details of this and the horrifying impact both on poor countries and the massive obstacle this places to climate action. Just how ecocidal really these policies are. So you can find out more about Hadrian's work at policyalternatives.ca, and we'll be talking to him a bit more during the discussion. Please do put your questions in the Q&A. And a reminder that the chat is open as well. So it was my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, DT Cochrane. Welcome, DT.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Bianca and Anjali, for your introductions. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this workshop. I will share my screen. Let's make sure I pick the right one. Hey, oh, and it looks like this is all going to work as I'm hoping it will. I'm actually presenting off a bit of a mind map. Or are you seeing my mind map? Is that what's showing up? Or are you seeing the taxes in the path to a green economy?
We see taxes. That looks right.
We see the front page.
Okay, excellent. So this is a report that I wrote with Canadians for Tax Fairness, where I was before I was with the Canadian Labour Congress. It was the last report I did when I was there, and it contains a lot of data about the ways that our tax system has systematically favored fossil fuel companies to the detriment of our emission reduction ambitions, and really to the detriment of all of us. It's going to require an even bigger push to get where we need to get to in terms of a just economy, and the subsidies that we effectively offer through our tax system just keep making that more and more difficult to achieve. But I'm not going to talk a lot about the evidence that we found, the statistics that are contained in that report. I'm not going to talk much about the policies that we advocate in that report. I actually want to talk about taxes kind of in the abstract, what it is that they are for, because every aspect of what taxes are for bear on our fight for climate justice and have a role to play in achieving climate justice. One of the reasons that we wrote this report was because we wanted to think about taxes and the way they relate to the fight for climate justice beyond the carbon tax. The carbon tax really just took up all the oxygen in the room and kind of became the be-all and end-all for how taxes are relevant to the climate, the fight for climate justice, to reduce our emissions. And we knew that there were other ways of using taxes and frankly, better ways of using taxes. And we wanted to explore some of those and describe how our tax system currently is moving us largely in the wrong direction, and make suggestions for how it could move us in the right direction. So the government of Canada, their approach to to reducing emissions, they have visualized in the last two budgets with this pyramid. And the pyramid shows that at the bottom, their foundation of their policy approach is pollution pricing and regulatory framework, meaning the carbon tax. This is their tentpole policy. Then on top of that, they have their investment tax credit. So in 2023 was when they really introduced a big chunk of tax credits. Both of these are explicitly market-driven policy formulations. These are viewed by economists as being the least distortionary to markets, which those orthodox economists understand as being the most efficient way that we can distribute resources. And there are lots of ways that the federal government does not adhere to market logic, but it's very much the overarching narrative of how they are approaching all of this. So the two base layers of their climate policy approach are both market driven. And they state this quite explicitly in the budget, saying Canada has taken a market-driven approach to emissions reduction. And this is the long-standing notion that markets know best. Most of the people here would probably call this neoliberalism. I want to say that this pyramid is exactly upside down, and that, in fact, our base should be this thing that they have called targeted programming. And we can think about that as being a form of green industrial policy. This would be identifying sectors that we need to be making investments in, that we can't count on the private sector to transform. We need our public sector leading on this. And that should be the foundation. And I'm a supporter of putting a price on carbon. It has essentially been a subsidy for 200 years that we've been able to freely dispose of carbon into the atmosphere, and the people who benefited from that disposal didn't pay for it. This is a contravention of really basic foundational orthodox economic thinking. So this subsidization of fossil fuels led to a massive overdevelopment of the fossil fuel dependent economy. So putting a price on those emissions, putting the cost of those emissions back onto our books is better rather than letting that implicit subsidy continue. Now, there are people who will be disproportionately and unfairly harmed by this, by putting a price on emissions, people who haven't been the primary beneficiaries of this subsidy, but now who are paying the cost because the carbon tax is making some things more expensive. Well, we still want to have the pricing on the books and then explicitly subsidize the people who we think are being unfairly harmed. Make all of this as visible and transparent and accountable as possible. So if we're going to have this green industrial policy, then we need to spend big. This is not a small dollar item. We need to be spending hundreds of billions of dollars in order to rapidly transform our economy in the way that is necessary, and that I think the vast majority of people understand is necessary. Even many of the people who are dragging their feet, kicking and screaming, resisting the transformation that needs to happen. And if we're going to be spending big, then obviously we need revenue, which is the purpose of taxes that people understand the best. It is the most familiar. I suspect there are some people in the audience who have been turned on to the arguments of MMT and maybe are screaming at me that, no, we don't need revenue in order to spend. Please just hold your thoughts for a moment and I will get back to that point. So revenue is the best known purpose for taxes. Two of the other major purposes for taxes are to redistribute income and wealth and to change people's behaviors. I am going to discuss each of these in turn, but I'm also going to suggest a fourth reason that we have taxes that doesn't get discussed in the academic literature. And this is something that I actually first started thinking about when I read Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, which is about modern monetary theory. It's a popularization of modern monetary theory. And then I thought about it further when I read Seth Klein's book, The Good War. And that fourth reason for taxes is to foster solidarity. Taxes are a way of making sure that all citizens are contributing resources to public provisioning. We have governments that provide certain goods and services, and taxes make sure that all of us sacrifice some of our own consumption in order to facilitate the consumption of others. And I think this is a really important and little considered aspect of taxes. And we'll talk about all of these more. In fact, that's my last slide. So I'm gonna stop sharing and stop share. And you can all just look at my face as I blather on going through my mind map. So I'm going to start with the changing behaviors aspect of taxation, because that's really what the carbon tax and these tax credits are supposed to do. The carbon tax is supposed to make higher emission goods and services more expensive, and so then we will consume those less. It's not intended to generate revenue for the government, which is why most of the money gets recycled to Canadians. And we see these reports coming out of the Parliamentary Budget Office, all kinds of debates and disagreements about who's being harmed, who's coming out ahead. But the reason it's formulated that way is because it's supposed to be inducing behavior change. The tax credits are also supposed to be inducing behavior change. In this case, by making the prospective taxes that will be paid by companies lower, inducing them to make the investments that we're wanting them to make in clean technology, clean energy generation. So this is really the foundation of the federal government's approach to achieving our emissions reduction, is this behavior change role for taxation. Economists love it, no one else does. Part of the reason I think that people have really had trouble with the carbon tax, again, I support it, but people are resistant to it because they don't understand how it makes sense to be sending this money back to us. Why aren't we using this money to be making investments in emissions reducing technologies directly? Why isn't the public sector using that revenue themselves? So the other aspect that the government has not, well, they have softly used it. They've talked about the carbon tax as having this redistribution function because lower income families get back more of what their higher costs are than higher income families. So there is a redistributionary aspect, and economists for the most part don't love that because that's not what it's supposed to be doing. But redistribution is a well understood function of our tax system. Jumping back to 1966, Canada had a Royal Commission on Taxation, which was intended to try to simplify our tax system and make it fair. It's popularly known as the Carter Commission. And they said there are three principles that a tax system should operate according to. The first is efficiency. You want it to be low cost to generate the maximum amount of revenue. You want it to be effective. You want the taxes you apply to do the thing that they're supposed to be doing. But the abiding ground principle is equity. Taxes need to be levied fairly. And they use, these are their terms, the phrase economic power. Taxes should be allocated according to economic power, meaning higher income individuals should pay taxes at a higher rate. So sometimes we'll see this defense of the current tax system, or even sometimes saying rich people are taxed too highly by pointing out, look at how much of our tax revenue comes from the top 10%. Well, that's because the top 10% also get a massive disproportionate amount of our market income. So it makes sense that they would pay a disproportionate amount of our taxes. So progressive taxation is a way of responding to unequal distribution of income. One thing the Carter commissioners couldn't have known about, and something that we write about in the report, is the incredibly unequal emissions associated with economic power. So people are maybe familiar with the data point that between 1990 and 2019, per capita emissions decreased 3.1 tons per person. But if you break that out by income distribution, the bottom 90% of Canadians actually reduced their emissions by 5 tons per person, while the top 1% increased their emissions by 34 tons per person. So the climate crisis itself is a reason why we should be having more redistribution through our tax system. Now, to the revenue piece of this, the thing that people are familiar with and which increasingly people are understanding, for a monetarily sovereign government like the Canadian government, we don't actually need. We don't need tax revenue in order to spend. And there's this paper that came out of the US Federal Reserve that's quite popular with MMTers titled "Taxation for Revenue is Obsolete." I completely reject that notion, not because I think we need revenue in order to spend, but I think all of us, even those with just the most rudimentary French, probably recognize that in revenue is the French revenir, which means to return. The whole purpose of taxes are to return that publicly spent money back into public hands. So Stephanie Kelton likes to say that it's not tax and spend, as is often launched at liberal and progressive governments, typical tax and spend governments. It's actually spend and tax or borrow. They spend money into the economy and then they'll tax back that money. So the federal debt is just money that has been spent and not taxed back yet. So the idea that federal spending is some burden on the future gets things exactly backwards. All that money is still out there waiting to eventually be taxed back, and we probably don't want to tax it all back. That would have hugely negative ramifications. So the taxation is a way to draw money out of the economy, which you want to do to create fiscal space, because too much money in the economy will generate inflation. So we want to use taxes strategically as a way of managing inflation. We also want to use taxes to reduce wealth concentration, because the money spent just has a tendency to find its way into the concentrated pools of the wealthiest individuals and the most powerful corporations. I like to use a metaphor that comes out of the world of finance. They refer to the cash holdings of corporations as dry powder. I like it because it's referring to explosives. So the money that's controlled, the wealth that's controlled by the ultra wealthy, we don't know when, where, and how it might blow up, but it has the potential to cause significant harm. And we can see that in action. They mobilize their wealth in order to fight against the policies that we know are needed. So taxes are a way of confronting and reducing the power of ultra wealthy owners and corporations. And so I want to finish by talking about this solidarity piece. Part of it is misery loves company. People complain about paying taxes. Now, you always encounter the people who say, like, I love paying taxes because I know that this is the way that I'm supporting my community. And absolutely, I partially have that feeling. That said, when it comes time to look and see how much taxes are coming off of my check, I don't love it, but I accept it if I feel like this is being allocated fairly. So one of the things I really took away from Seth's book was that in World War I, the working class never bought into the war effort. They felt like it was their children and their money that was fighting this war. World War II, the government learned its lesson, and so they really signaled, we are taxing from the top first. We're going to have these incredibly high marginal tax rates at the very top. We're going to have incredibly high excess profit taxes. We are going to make sure that no one is getting rich from all of this, and you are paying the cost of fighting the war effort. What that meant was, once the government came to your level and said, we have to increase your taxes in order to fight the war effort, you were going to be much more accepting of that if you believed that everyone above you was also paying their fair share. So taxes are an important way of signaling fairness. So when we talk about, let's have higher tax brackets with these very high marginal tax rates, say, 85% on incomes over $500,000, orthodox economists will always come back, that will hardly generate any revenue. What's the point? They are missing the point. The point is to show to everyone, we're not allowing anyone to make this amount of money. No one has earned that. No one deserves that. And we are going to respond to it. And part of what it's supposed to do is change behavior. Stop companies from paying those salaries because they will be taxed back so heavily. So the reason I have brought this to you rather than these policy prescriptions, this evidence of how our tax system has made our climate fight more difficult, is because I really want to empower folks to start thinking about how we can be using taxes as part of the fight for climate justice. No one has a monopoly on policy-making genius. No one has a monopoly on what policies can be or should be. More people need to be jumping into the fray. And taxes in particular are an area where people are very hesitant to jump into the fray. And I understand why. They are very complex. That complexity is often used against us. But I want more people starting from the basic principles of what taxes are for and thinking about the policies that could apply those principles to make sure that we get a just transition to a post-carbon economy. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, DT, for that wonderful, wonderful overview and for sharing the all those findings from the report. It's really fascinating to dive into these sort of lesser known reasons for tax, from changing behavior to solidarity in particular, and just to be grounded in the principles that you've laid out and how they can relate to this larger struggle for climate justice. And I love this invitation that you have put out there to jump into the fray. It would be good to normalize being educated around the tax system so we can't be fearmongered and confused out of understanding, and demanding that this tax system play its part to help dig us out of this crisis. So really appreciating hearing about the empowerment that you describe and the need for that, and also just the need to push for this public sector leadership, right? With regard to the big spending that we need for this great transition. So thank you, DT. I'm looking forward to hearing more from you in the discussion. We have now finished the introductory remarks, and we'll be heading into our Q&A session. We don't have very long for it, so I'm just going to dive right in. I had a question sort of coming out of the CCPA report for Hadrian. There's a place, a place that sounded sort of hopeful for me and exciting. It said, a sweeping multilateral agreement could neuter ISDS challenges among signatories with a single stroke of a pen. Could you say more about this and how that might work?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yeah, because one of the big challenges with undoing this ISDS system is, as I said, there's thousands of these agreements. For Canada, it's dozens or maybe 100. Some economists call it like a spaghetti bowl is the situation because it's so complicated and hard to untangle. And that makes it really hard because if we're trying to get rid of ISDS, there's not one place to do it. You have to renegotiate every single separate agreement, and you need that other government to come to the table, and then you have to take out ISDS. that's what some countries are doing. There's countries like India and Bolivia around the world saying like, we've had enough of this system. We're backing out, and they're working on that. So Canada could do that, and we should do that when we're negotiating. But there's a potential, and there's a growing movement around basically like a climate carve out or something else like that, which would just be like a single document, whether through the World Trade Organization or separate. If you could just get like a whole bunch of countries, not even every country, just like a whole bunch of countries to sign it and say, we will not allow, ISDS claims to proceed if they're challenging climate measures, or challenging environmental justice measures. And then in theory, that could supersede all of the hundreds or thousands of agreements that are already out there. So yeah, within the trade justice space, like there's different views on like what the priority should be strategically, but there are ways that we could tackle ISDS in kind of one fell swoop, which would be a big win versus doing it piecemeal.
Thank you. All right, so maybe worth keeping our eyes on the prize in terms of some of these campaigns. We have a question from the audience. Somebody is asking, how does trade impact our subsidizing of fossil fuels? How does this affect the LNG industry in BC owned by a number of foreign governments? Would either panelist like to tackle this question?
I'm going to go first. I think it's a great question because LNG is, because I saw the question, I just like pulled up the federal government's like news release, and they're like, biggest private sector investment in Canadian history, $40 billion, which like sounds great. It is all foreign investment. And that means it's a consortium of companies from different countries that like own stakes in LNG Canada. But it's a great question because yes, at least some of them, and probably all of them, are covered by one or more of these international investment agreements. And that's relevant because this is where the subsidy part comes in. It makes it extremely costly for a future government to try and undo that. Because now we're in a situation where if like a new provincial government or a new federal government came in and said, LNG Canada is inconsistent with our climate commitments, inconsistent with our climate justice priorities, we are now shuttering this facility. Like we would be exposed to tons and tons and tons of these ISDS cases and legal challenges that could cost the government more than $40 billion, right? At the end of the day, who knows? Like that's the problem. Is like we have no idea what the government would have to pay out in this case. So the risk of just like a massive payout due to these trade agreements would be a consideration for any future Canadian government that was trying to do something about LNG Canada or any other fossil fuel infrastructure. I mentioned the coal example earlier, where the stakes were in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. LNG Canada it's like an order of magnitude or two higher. So it just makes it that much more challenging for governments to deal with it.
Thank you, Hadrian. DT, your thoughts?
I don't really have anything to add more intelligent on top of what Hadrian said. It is a sticky issue, and I will say that finance and accounting can really restrict what governments can do. I know that the NDP government's refusal to cancel the Site C dam was because of the accounting impact that it would have, and then the financial consequences of that. Now, that doesn't mean we need to be beholden to these things, but it does mean that our movement needs more people who are knowledgeable about these areas in order to come up with the creative solutions, the ways around obstacles that we essentially create for ourselves. The example I know the best is the US debt ceiling that they impose that has to continually be renegotiated higher. And this is where we get this brinksmanship that, oh, we're going to come up against the debt ceiling, and then now federal employees are not going to be paid, and there's going to be all this widespread default. So governments really, sometimes accidentally, but often on purpose, create restrictions on themselves to prevent them from constraining powerful actors in our society, which is one of the main reasons why those powerful actors never stop trying to gain control of every little piece of the government. They don't want less government. They just want government that governs in their interests. Because then they can put in place these rules that make it more difficult, even when progressive governments get elected, to affect the change that needs to be affected without some significant unintended consequences that can cause other kinds of even worse harms.
Thank you, DT. So continuing on the subject of taxes, there's some questions in the chat around mining, for instance, and I know that we have some mining activists here as well in the audience. So it's well known that a number of big Canadian mining companies reduce their tax burden by opening offices in places like the Caribbean, in Caribbean tax havens. And I'm wondering if there's been any attempts to quantify the role of Canadian-backed tax havens in these, in fossil fuel extraction specifically. Do either of you know whether this information is out there kind of in one place?
Quantifying the tax avoidance, quantifying the wealth flows going into tax havens is already extremely difficult, just at the most aggregate level. The best estimates we have come from the Parliamentary Budget Officer. They're probably, quite conservative, but still show that this is tens of billions of dollars a year that we're losing out on. Coming down to the sectoral level, I don't know of anything that has created that estimate. It would be extremely valuable because one of our report did not look at mining at all. It was looking specifically at fossil fuels, but we showed that the fossil fuel sector, they're frankly creative geniuses at using our tax system in their interests. And I have no doubt that the mining sector is as well. We have lots of preferential tax treatments for extraction, and they employ a lot of lawyers and accountants whose job is to figure out how to use those creatively. And part of that creative use is shifting profits in order to avoid taxes here at home or anywhere.
Thank you. For any folks on on this call who might be sort of activists or engaged in this, I'm wondering whether either UDT or Hadrian could give any examples of Canadian fossil fuel companies specifically that have used an investment tribunal to defend their interests.
So I think the short answer is there actually aren't, not any, but very few that I'm aware of, for two reasons. I mean, there's a couple, like if you look in the report, like there's like Van Oil started to sue Kenya and then never really followed up on it. But anyway, I think the short version is, one, most of our oil companies are just digging oil out of Canada. There aren't, like, our oil companies aren't operating abroad in the same way that our mining companies are. But the second reason I think we haven't seen very many of these cases is that at present, most countries are not phasing out oil production, right? So this is why this is a big future problem. Is there's actually, I'll link it in the chat. There's a paper that my colleague Kyla Tianhera published that estimated that there's at least $300 billion in potential ISDS claims from attempting to phase out oil and gas assets around the world. And we just haven't touched that because, like, no government is really seriously considering that, or very few are. So there aren't specific, like, the short answer is there aren't specific cases, but I think there could be a lot moving forward. So that's an important one to keep an eye on.
Thank you. Thank you, Hadrian. So we've almost run out of time. So I think I'm just going to group a couple of questions that we have here around essentially accountability. Someone asks, why doesn't the Canadian media, like CBC's Fifth Estate or Globe and Mail, report on the human rights and environmental exploitation by Canadian mining companies, and maybe relating that to what we've discussed today around trade and tax? And then someone else asks, perhaps a good closing question, as citizens, how can we effectively advocate for both fair trade and environmental responsibility of Canada abroad and better tax policy? So maybe I'll start with you, DT, on any part of those questions, and then we'll finish with you, Hadrian.
Well, I mean, there is some reporting on these kinds of things. I don't have specific mentions, but it does get some coverage. I would say this is probably mostly an issue with our media ecosystem and corporate ownership and the loss of journalism of all sorts. In terms of of what to do, I don't have any kind of new creative thing other than organizing, talking, coming back to that like misery loves company aspect of taxes. You know, if your neighbor is complaining about their taxes, I would suggest don't be the person who's like, I love paying taxes. You know, depending on the conversation, you can, but instead, like, find some solidarity with them and then pivot. Say like, oh yeah, sucks. And you know what? I heard that the 0.1%, they actually pay a lower tax rate than we do. So at this point, I'm going to plug another report that I wrote, actually, that came out with the CCPA. I wrote it with Mark Lee, one of their economists, on what's called tax incidence. So it looks at all the taxes that Canadians pay across the income distribution. And at the lower end of our income distribution, we actually have a very modestly progressive tax system. So the tax rate gets higher as your income rises. Then through most of it, it's a flat tax. We basically pay at the same rate. And then at the very top end, it becomes regressive. And so the top 0.1% pays a lower tax rate than the bottom 95%. That's something that pisses people off. So making them aware of the fact that our system's not fair and it should be fairer. A thing at Canadians for Tax Fairness that we always had to be careful of was we could find all these examples of egregious tax avoidance, evasion by corporations, but people know those stories for the most part, and it can lead to cynicism and fatalism that, well, this is just the way it always is. So we also have to talk about, here are the things that we can do. And the main things we can do are relatively simple: increasing corporate income tax rate, implementing a wealth tax, taxing capital gains fully, just like we do other income. And if you go and read basically any report from Canadians for Tax Fairness, you'll find those policy prescriptions. And the report that I was presenting off of Taxes and the Path to a Green Economy, it does include a lot of policy suggestions, including some that are kind of, a little blue sky thinking, experimental, not things that are implemented elsewhere that we're saying we could adopt.
Thank you, DT. Okay, yeah, so let's all keep up with Canadians for Tax Fairness. And then, if I can summarize what you said, organize, educate, and make people angry. I think that's great advice. Hadrian.
Sure. Thanks again. I'll kind of rapid fire through a few of these. The question around like why, isn't there more media coverage? I mean, I think it's a combination of, in general, we mostly look inward, right? We don't really look outside Canada for news very often. But it's also that like a lot of these specific issues are happening in places that are just underreported. So if there's like protests around a mine in a place like Peru, that's just not really on our radar. And it's not really on anyone's radar. Like, it's not like any media is covering this except for local media, which is not going to be in English. So there's just like a lot of challenges. And then the ISDS system itself, because it's private, like it's not like public policy, which, there's an obligation in a country like Canada to disclose when things are happening. That doesn't happen. Like ISDS cases go on for years and years and years of private hearings that we never find out about. So there's just not a lot of transparency, which is a big problem. How do we advocate more effectively? I don't think there's like a magic solution here. And I mean, I'm more of a policy guy than a politics guy, but we do need to make this part of the conversation and connect trade justice to issues of climate justice in the same way that we do connect them to issues like human rights and Indigenous reconciliation. All of these issues are connected and we can all support each other in these different movements. And then I just wanted to end on a great question that Laura Cameron put in the Q&A, which is, hey, does this ever go the other way around? Does ISDS allow governments to sue these corporations when they don't uphold their obligations? And the answer is no. This is an extremely one-sided, unbalanced system where all it does is give multinational corporations extra rights and gives them no additional responsibility or obligations. It's a system that's so one-sided that there is no reason for a company not to sue through ISDS. Because if they lose, whatever, their investment was already worth less money. So who cares? You might as well try. And if you win, you might make $100 million or $1 billion. So the system incentivizes companies to just throw anything at the wall and see what sticks. And every once in a while, one of these cases is won at a great cost to the public. So thanks for the questions and thanks for your time, everyone.
Thank you so much, Hadrian. Yeah, so outrageous to hear about this one-sidedness. But yes, again, let's keep talking about this. As Hadrian said, let's make the connections. So that is all the time we have for our Q&A and for this discussion. I want to thank you so much to our audience first for joining us for this exploration of trade reform and progressive tax instruments as financial levers for global equity. Thanks to our brilliant panelists who made things so accessible for us, Hadrian Mertins-Kirkwood and DT Cochrane. Thank you, Anjali Appadurai, for your intro and the tremendous organizing of this summit. Thanks to Doug and Aaron for all your work behind the scenes, to Sophia and Olivia for note-taking. Thanks to the good people at the Padma Center for Climate Justice and the Climate Emergency Unit for organizing this event and summit. And again, to the attendees for being here and for your questions and engagement. I want to remind people that a final session will be taking place tomorrow at 12:30 PT, 3:30 ET, where we're going to be hearing next steps and closing thoughts. Today, please do stick around for the workshop that's going to be taking this discussion further. It will be returning to the Statement of Unity, discussing unified policy demands, for how Canada can pay its fair share, and panelists and facilitators will really walk us through and talk through the many mechanisms and campaigns to pay for fair shares through taxes, levies on the wealthiest, and many other methods. So stick around. And really, before we leave, I just want to remind people that while these are trying times and so bleak on so many levels, it is worth noting how quickly things can shift when we work together, when we see our struggles intertwined, and when we move in the same direction. I think that the impossible can very suddenly become very possible. So let's try and imagine that on a global scale. Let's move towards it by prioritizing global unity and solidarity, and by playing our part and by paying our fair share. So thanks to everyone. Such a pleasure to be a part of this. And I'm now going to hand it over to Anjali to take us into the workshop.
I want us to give a big virtual applause and gratitude to our panelists and to our brilliant moderator for taking us through so elegantly, so brilliantly through such difficult subject matter.